Good afternoon, everyone. So I don't have any students, excuse me, I don't have any students in this review session, but I am going to go ahead and go through and do a review for the second exam. And then hopefully those who want to will come back or will come into the Blackboard Collaborate room and watch the video later. So I'm just going to start and run through chapters 7 through 10 and go through the items that are on the study guide. So to start off in chapter 7, the first learning objective says to distinguish between emotion and motivation. So let's start here. So motivation and emotion are closely related processes that work together to help people fulfill their goals. It's important to understand how they're different, but also how they support and interact with each other. While people may use the terms interchangeably in casual conversation, motivation and emotion reflect different biological processes. Motivations are psychological processes that define our goals and guide goal-directed behavior. Emotions are combinations of physical sensations in the body and subjective feelings that we experience automatically in response to certain kinds of stimuli. No different, motivation and emotion must work together to define and help fulfill our goals. On one hand, motivations help determine the kinds of stimuli that evoke emotional reactions. If some event has no implication for your goals, then you're unlikely to have strong feelings about it. On the other hand, emotions make particular motivations salient or important and promote action to fulfill those motivations. So as you can see, they work in a somewhat circular fashion, as is depicted on the slide. So the second objective on the study guide for exam 2 is to explain the biological, social, and cognitive correlates of emotional expression and assessment. So if you look at this slide, in order to understand what an emotion is, you have to understand it in terms of its 4 different components. So the first component is the cognitive component, which is the interpretation or appraisal of a stimulus or an event. And if you think about in positive psychology, I believe we've briefly mentioned that it's an offshoot of the humanistic approach, which was discussed in the first chapter of the textbook, and it's actually a very positive psychology is a very prominent perspective in psychology where we actually are able to change our interpretations of stimuli or events in our lives and maybe help ourselves focus more on positive kinds of things as opposed to negative. I shouldn't say things, I should say thoughts, and focus more on positive types of thoughts as opposed to negative. So then the second component is your subjective feeling about a stimulus or an event. And that is actually what you label something as, what you believe that you feel. And although there are 7 universal emotions, there are any number of feeling labels that we can give to whatever emotion it is we're experiencing. And then next, the third component is our physiological response to a stimulus or an event. And so that has to do with our bodily arousal, typically the autonomic nerve system, where you are Uh, if you're aroused, then your heart will start beating faster. Your breathing will become faster. Um, you may start shaking. You may start sweating, and so on. And then also are neural circuits involved to the physiological response to an emotion. And I'll talk about those in just a little bit. And then finally, the behavioral component has to do with how we express our emotions. And there are universal facial expressions to the 7 universal emotions, which I'm going to show you. And there are certain muscles that are activated that or in our face that those are involved in the behavioral expression, especially in our face. But a behavioral expression can also be in our body language. All right, so continuing on, one of the things we want to remember if we're looking at emotions from a neuroscience or a physiological approach, we have to remember that the amygdala, and we've encountered the amygdala before, it actually is our emotional detector in the subcortical region of our brain. It's also the emotional memorizer for particular types of stimuli or events in our lives. And so there are neural circuits in our brain that work to help us interpret incoming information. What you see on this slide is whenever we see a visual image, of course it's on the back of the retina, and a signal is sent to the thalamus, which is here, and then the thalamus sends a signal to the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. Now, if this were an auditory signal, of course it would be in the temporal lobe, not in the occipital lobe. But anyway, this is just an example. And then the occipital lobe sends the neural circuitry goes to the amygdala, and remember, it's the emotional detector, and then a signal is sent to the frontal cortex in the brain. And that's the part that will make a judgment about what it is we're supposed to do. If it's something dangerous and it's for our survival, then we're going to interpret it as something that's dangerous, and we need to either fight or flee or maybe even freeze. So the fight or flight response would kick in. Now, it's interesting how the circuitry is different, though. If it is something that's dangerous, what happens is the third step is skipped. And so the circuitry would work like this. It would be step 1, step 2, skip step 3, and go to step 4. So the whole lobe in the cerebral cortex that would be involved in helping us perceive a signal would be skipped and go straight from the thalamus to the amygdala. And that's because we have to make a fast decision in order to survive. And then, of course, the signal would go to the frontal cortex, and that part of the brain would say, in this situation, I better get away from this wolf, or I better figure out a way to fight him off. So now let's look at the 7 universal emotions. These are the different emotions: happy, surprise, contempt, sadness, fear, anger, disgust. And so those are the 7 universal emotions that have been put together by psychologists and neuroscientists. And it's really interesting, if you've seen the cartoon movie Inside Out, the producers of that movie did a really good job of depicting anger, disgust, joy or happiness, fear, and sadness. And it's a really nice portrayal of our universal emotions. Now, even though we just we show our emotions in our facial expressions around the world, different cultures have different what are called different display rules for what is appropriate to do in order to express an emotion. So you can see here in this slide that the universal expression of happiness around the world, these are 4 different cultures, is a smile. And you see it in all of these people's faces. But you can also see that there's a difference in how appropriate it is to express the emotion, or how demonstrative you should be in expressing your emotion. So you see that this person, her smile is not as big or as pronounced as this person's smile is. And so in different cultures, our display rules are very different about how we should go about expressing our emotions. This bar chart in your textbook, it shows you that cultures vary in suppressing their emotional expression. And so you can tell by this bar chart that in Hong Kong, they have the most, their culture has the most suppression of emotional expression. And so Hong Kong, it's not really appropriate, for example, with a smile, to express happiness, it's not really appropriate to make a big smile, because that's not part of what is understood as appropriate in Hong Kong. Whereas the country on here that has the least suppression is Switzerland. So in Switzerland, it's a-okay to smile really big when you're feeling happy. So that's just something to keep in mind, that different cultures have different rules about what is appropriate in order to express emotion. So that's that I believe that answers the second learning objective for chapter 7. And then the last learning objective that we want to take a look at is describing the motivations of affiliation and achievement in light of systems explaining the prioritization of motives. So the most famous motivational theory is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he states in his theory that in order for us to have reach our full potential, he was a humanist. So remember, humanists believe that we all strive to become the best person that we can be. So the reaching your full potential for Maslow was to be a self-actualized person. But before you can do this, you actually have to meet your lower physiological needs, which is for food, water, have sex to keep the species going, and then to sleep. And without these things, our species would not survive. In fact, an individual person would die from starvation or lack of water or lack of sleep. And you have to get your safety needs met, which is to have a roof over your head and to be protected from the elements, to be protected from predators. And then if you get those needs met, you move on to love and belonging needs. And that's the need to affiliate with other people and to be accepted by them. And then the next is your achievement and your esteem needs. Maslow's theory, it actually has been criticized because, of course, there are people who forego their level 1 and level 2 needs in order to skip all the way up to their achievement needs. More than likely, you have actually not slept, stayed up all night studying for a test so that you would meet your achievement needs because you wanted to do well on the test. And so that's where you actually you skip the lower needs to move up to the higher needs. So that's one criticism of his theory. So just to talk about what he meant by self-actualized person, here are the characteristics that he said people who are self-actualized exhibit. One of the interesting ones is mystical and peak experiences, which those are especially spiritual experiences that people who are self-actualized exhibit. And he studied historical figures in um, his research about self-actualized people. And so he listed Gandhi as one of the self-actualized people, also Eleanor Roosevelt. He listed Abraham Lincoln as another self-actualized person. So these are people who have reached their full potential, and they are they have felt like that they had a mission in the world, and they are able to achieve that mission. All right, so then I just also want to point out, in as far as motivation is concerned, there is a physiological or a brain base to motivation, and that is that the hypothalamus is very much involved in helping us detect our lower level needs, our need for food and water. Um, and the lateral part of the hypothalamus uh, increases our appetite, and the ventromedial part of the hypothalamus actually decreases our appetite. So now, just a little bit more about motivation. There is there are cognitive influences on what motivates us. So there are intrinsic motivators and extrinsic motivators. So intrinsic motivators are those that actually come from within us, and there's something that fulfill us, and we do something because it's the right thing to do, like giving blood. And then there are extrinsic motivators, which are ones that we do for some sort of reward, such as selling a car and getting a bonus for doing that. Here's a little bit more on it. If you're intrinsically motivated, you're motivated from within, and whatever you're doing is a labor of love. So some examples are if you're learning for learning's sake, or if you're reading a nonfiction book because you're curious about the topic. An extrinsic motivator is motivated from without, or externally motivated. And in the next chapter on when we talk about operant conditioning, and then we're talking about uh, uh, seeking rewards. And so this extrinsic motivators are considered to be a chore. For example, if you're motivated to make an A, or you're getting money for your grades, then you're extrinsically motivated. And so it's not really a good idea for parents to reward children by giving them money for their grades, because you're actually interfering with their own intrinsic motivation of being curious to learn. And then also another example is if you pick a college major based on earning money or prestige, then you're extrinsically motivated. Now, of course, intrinsic motivation is ideal. However, in some cases, extrinsic motivators are appropriate if you wanted to change a habit or something like that, or if you're starting to take up some sort of exercise. For example, if you're wearing a Fitbit and you set a goal of getting so many steps a day, well, you're getting extrinsic motivation from that Fitbit when it tells you that you have met your step goal. So it takes both of these, but it's especially important if people are reaching towards their intrinsic goals. All right, so that is chapter 7, and now let me move to chapter 8. So for chapter 8, I'm just going to go through the all the objectives at once. And we're going to look at the first one is on the difference between reflexes, instincts, and learned behaviors. And then we're going to look at the components of classical conditioning. And then we're going to look at operant conditioning. And then we are going to look at the processes of observational learning. Okay, so reflexes and instincts and learning, they're all three mechanisms by which animals, including humans, respond adaptively to the objects and events around them. But they differ in how complex they are, how flexible they are, and also whether or not experience shapes the response. So reflexes and instincts are much more simple than learning because learning is more involved. It involves actually a permanent change in behavior or knowledge as a result of experience. So with reflexes and instincts, there is no learning that's actually required for a particular behavior to be exhibited or a particular response to be exhibited. So let me just show you some examples of reflexes and instincts. So a reflex is something that comes from the lower part of the brain. And an example is you're getting a neurological evaluation and you're tapped on the knee with one of those hammers, and your thigh muscle stretches out and your foot kicks out. And so basically you're doing that. You don't have any control over that. And you don't have any control over reflexes. They do help you survive, but they're much more simple. Another example is if something comes towards your eyes, what do? You blink. And so there's simple types of responses, but they do help us. They serve an adaptive process. Instincts are a little bit more involved. But again, they're just like with reflexes, we don't have to learn those. They are automatic. For example, when a baby kangaroo is born, it climbs into its mother's pouch, and that's an immediate response. It didn't get that Joey didn't get taught to do that. It just does it. The mother doesn't coax it to come into her pouch. The Joey just jumps in there. Another example is when salmon swim upstream in order to spawn. They do it at the same time of year in the same location. That's an instinct. And of course, it's a little bit higher order brain process. But again, no learning is required for that behavior to occur. It's a lot harder. It's easy actually to identify instincts in animals, but it's a lot harder to identify those in human beings. I mean, I guess our biggest instinct is to stay alive and not to die, and so that is the one thing that we can name about human instincts. All right, so with learning, as I said, it's a permanently or at least enduring pattern of change in behavior that's a result of knowledge or experience, or you get a gain in knowledge. Okay, so a stimulus is anything that you can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell in the environment, and a response is a behavior, a physiological reaction, a thought, or an emotion. So we're going to go through classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and also observational learning, which is the last type that's listed on your study guide. So classical conditioning, it's an associative type of learning in which a neutral stimulus acquires the ability to produce a response that was originally produced for a different stimulus. So really there are 4 different types of elements in classical conditioning, and Ivan Pavlov is the one who came up with this this theory of learning. So in the textbook, it's explained with an unconditioned stimulus, no conditioning is required in order to get a response. So if a dog sees food or meat, it naturally salivates. And so the stimulus is the food and the response is the salivation. And it's a reflexive response. And then you have a period of conditioning where there's a sound with the food, and of course you get the salivation because the meat is in there. And then after conditioning, what happens is you have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response, and the bell, the sound produces the salivation, and it is not natural for a dog to salivate at a sound. So it has been conditioned, or it has learned that response. So this is a triangle I use to help me distinguish the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. So what you have to have is a pairing of the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus in order to get a conditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus, there's no conditioning required for that response, the unconditioned response. With the conditioned stimulus, you do have to have conditioning required to get the conditioned response. So I'm going to give you, I'm going to go to Watson's work with little Albert. He conditioned children, not just little Albert, but some other children, to be afraid of a white rat. So you have the unconditioned stimulus, which is the loud gong, would of course produce fear in a baby or a young child. And so that's the unconditioned response. And after a pairing of the gong with the rat becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the child is now afraid of the white rat. And little Albert did what was called stimulus generalization, in that he was also afraid of other furry things, a dog, a monkey, and Watson put on a weird-looking mask that had fur on it. And so he became afraid of furry things. Of course, we wouldn't let Watson do this research now, because to do that, to condition fears in a baby and young children, we wouldn't let him use his other subjects either, it would be considered unethical. And normally a little child is not going to be afraid of furry creatures, not even a white rat, because they're going to be curious about them, because they haven't about the furry creatures because they haven't encountered them before. So Watson actually took his work with classical conditioning and into the advertising world. And here's an example of where advertisers use classical conditioning to get us to buy products. I took this picture ad off of the internet, and it's showing you what advertisers do to us. They give us something that's really humorous, that gives us, or humorous, or it doesn't have to be humorous. It just gives us a pleasant emotional response. And so what they're hoping is that with the pairing of their ad with their product, that we will have the same pleasant emotional response when we go into the grocery store or wherever, and we'll buy their product. So athletes are sell sneakers and all athletic gear, um, and that's classical conditioning. All right, so that's classical. Now let's move to operant conditioning, and B.F. Skinner is the big theorist there. Here's B.F. Skinner with one of his rats in his Skinner box. And here is a table that I came up with to help you distinguish operant conditioning, the elements, the stimuli, and the consequences in operant conditioning. So what you need to do to determine what type of consequence or stimulus it is figure out when it's occurring, what its purpose is, and of course I've got some examples here. So with positive reinforcement, it's something pleasant. It occurs after the behavior, and what you're trying to do is increase the behavior in the future. An example is gold stars on children's homework. A negative reinforcer, that's unpleasant, and it occurs before the behavior, and then it's removed after the behavior. Because it's a reinforcer, you're trying to increase that behavior in the future. So an example of that is a shock until the rat presses a lever. And I'm gonna go back to this slide here. Okay, so this slide, this is a Skinner box, and so what in his boxes, this illustration, he would have a shock generator that would put a small bit of electricity on these grids, and then if a rat pressed a lever, then it would make the shock go away. So what happened was it increased the likelihood that the rat would press the lever in the future in order to avoid the shock. All right, and then another example of a negative reinforcer is if you have a headache, which is your negative reinforcer, it's unpleasant, and you take an aspirin and that headache goes away, what happens is it's increasing the likelihood that you're going to take an aspirin in the future to get rid of that headache. All right. Now, punishment, it occurs after the behavior, and what you're trying to do there is you want to stop the behavior from occurring in the future. And of course, you know that spanking and time out, those are examples of punishment that occur after the behavior. You're trying to stop the behavior from occurring to begin with. Okay, now let's move to something related to operant conditioning. So Skinner had a process called shaping, and what that process was is that you don't wait until you get the exact reinforcer that you want to get. What you do is you reward behaviors that get you close to what you want to get. For example, we use shaping in order to potty train children. We can't wait until they actually use the potty in order to get them potty trained. We have to actually initially start out just praising them for sitting on the potty. So this is an example here of where he is shaping a dog named Agnes to do the behavior he wants. He wants her to automatically come into the room and go straight to this wall and jump up at these horizontal lines that are on the wall. And so what he has done is he rewarded her for doing things that are close to what he wants. And so in about 20 minutes, he was able to reinforce her to get her to automatically come into the room and jump up on the wall. So that's operant conditioning. Now, I should say that F. Skinner did not like the idea of punishment. He thought that you should always use negative or positive reinforcement, because if you use punishment, then you're going to make an animal or a child either afraid of you, and or it will make them more aggressive. And so he really felt like you should stay away from punishment if at all possible. So that's operant conditioning. Now let's move to cognitive learning or observational learning. So the thing that's different between operant conditioning and classical conditioning, they are pure behaviorism, and the theorists there do not believe that humans have a choice about what they respond to. Whereas with cognitive learning, the theorists there, they give animals and humans the credit for having thinking processes, for having cognitive processes. And so they give human beings free will, and they even give animals some credit for having a thinking process. With operant and classical conditioning, the pure behaviorists, they just simply thought we were like, we as humans were like machines, and all we do is we look for stimuli to respond to. So now one type of cognitive learning is Albert Bandura's observational learning. And this is where we imitate models in the environment. But we don't have to be rewarded for those behaviors that we do. And we don't even have to see the model actually doing something. We can imagine it. So there's a process involved, and it's much more complicated than simply responding to a stimulus. So Albert Bandura's famous Bobo doll study, he actually had an experimental group of children who watched a woman model on a film beat up Bobo, one of those clown blow-up toys that if you knock it down, it comes back up again. And she would say things like, "Pow," right in the nose, and "Suckaroo," stay down. And the children in the experimental group who watched this video, they were more likely to go into this room of toys and immediately go to Bobo, whereas the control group children, they were less likely to go towards Bobo. They would actually even look at some of the other toys, and they weren't nearly as aggressive. And these were preschool children that he did in his study, and these are, or that he used in his study. And this is a little boy and a little girl in the study who went immediately and started beating up on Bobo and even saying the things that the adult model had said. So Bandura definitely illustrated in this research that the majority of those children who watched that adult role model would imitate that aggressive behavior, and that was the majority of them. But these are some other examples of observational cognitive learning. Medical students, they learn to do surgery by first observing the other surgeons doing, the licensed surgeons doing their surgery. And of course, coaches use observational learning to teach athletes how to do, to hit a goal or whatever. And then if you wanted to learn some dance moves, you could do it by watching Dancing with the Stars. So that's chapter 8. Now we'll move to chapter 9. So for Chapter 9, the objectives there are for understanding encoding, storage, and retrieval of in memory, and knowing the difference in sensory, short-term, and long-term memory, and then the different subtypes of long-term memory, and how long-term memories are organized. Also, retrieval in short-term and long-term memory, and understanding different types of forgetting, and then also the biological correlates of memory. So I'm going to quickly run through some things on Chapter 9. And then do Chapter 10. Okay, so this is the process of our human memory. First, we have to encode information, which is to get it in there, to get it into our memory. And then we have 3 memory system stores. We have sensory memory, and then we have short-term or working memory, and then we have long-term memory. And there are different types of memory. There is sensory memory, different types of long-term memory. So with sensory memory, which is very, very brief, for any of your senses, you can have a memory associated with that. So there's visual memory, or sometimes it's called iconic memory. And then we have auditory or acoustic memory, which involves our hearing. And we have haptic memory, which is memory of the sense of touch. And then if we are able to encode information and move it from sensory to short-term memory, and then if we rehearse it, it'll move from short-term to long-term memory. I'm going to go through short-term memory here and then long-term memory. Okay, so our short-term memory, it's limited in duration, so it only will last about 20 to 30 seconds unless we rehearse the information. And rehearsal means that we repeat it verbally or we think about the information to hold it. And our memory, as far as the short-term memory, the amount of capacity we have, there is a formula called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2 bits or pieces of information without chunking it. So that 7 plus or minus 2 would be from 5 to 9 pieces of information that we can store at any one time in our short-term memory, unless we chunk, which is where you group familiar stimuli for storage as a single unit. So I'm going to give you an example of that. Right, so I have 12 letters up here, and if I ask you to memorize those, it would be rather difficult for you to do that because it's beyond the capacity of your short-term memory. And even with rehearsal, it may be difficult for you to actually remember. But if I do this, and I separate that into 4 chunks of information. What I have up here actually is I've got acronyms for law enforcement agencies. So I've got it CIA, FBI, DEA, and ICE. Those are all for law enforcement agencies. And so now that I've chunked it that way, it would be really easy for you to memorize those letters because it's chunked into 4 and they're meaningful units of information, and it's only 4, so it's definitely within the capacity of short-term memory. Okay, so now memory moving from short-term to long-term. As far as we know, long-term memory is unlimited, and we have pretty much permanent storage in long-term memory. In other words, our brains are phenomenal as far as storing memories. One of the pieces of evidence for permanent storage is what are called flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are especially emotional memories, such as on our wedding day, things like that. And if they're tied to emotions, then they can be very detailed and vivid. So those are flashbulb memories. However, even anytime with long-term memories, anytime we take that information out and we discuss it with someone else, or if we read something related to that memory, then we may change that information around, and when we restore it, it's not going to be an exact duplicate of what it was initially when we put it back in. So the different types of long-term memory, there's declarative, which is explicit memory, and we have 2 types there, semantic and episodic. So semantic memories are memories for general knowledge and concepts. So in what I have up here, these are different breakfast foods. So that would be stored in our semantic memory. Now, episodic memory, they're episodes of things that happen in our lives. And if the more sensory experience we have, the more likely we are to have to store that information and recall it later. And then we have procedural memory, and that's another type of long-term memory, and that's for how to do certain types of things. So so we encode information, we store it, and then we retrieve it, and that is to get information out of memory. And so so what causes us to forget? Why do we forget information? And there are a number of different studies that show us why we forget things. One of the reasons is that something called the serial position effect, or it's also known as the primacy and recency effect. So whenever you're learning something, in this example, this bar graph is showing us it's not a bar graph, I'm sorry, it's a graph. It's showing us that this is for memorizing words. It shows us that we are more apt to if we're memorizing the words, we're more apt to remember the words that are at the beginning of the list and the words that are at the end of the list. And the ones that are in the middle of the list, we're less likely to recall those. So this is the primacy effect, remembering the things at the beginning, and this is the recency effect, remembering the things at the end. But both of those are the serial position effect. So that's you know, the information we forget is going to be what's in the middle. Sometimes we forget because of interference. So one type of interference is retroactive, where new learning interferes with old. And then another type is proactive interference, which is where old learning interferes with new. Sometimes we forget because we're motivated to forget. We forget that we've got dirty dishes in the sink that need to be washed. We forget that we have a psychology exam that we need to take tomorrow. Another reason why we forget is what's called mass practice. So the psychology research shows that in order for us to learn things, it's better for us to do it in small bits of time until we master that information before we move on to something else. And that mastery training that you have in your mind tap, the practice assignments that I've given you for mind tap, the mastery training, that is based on psychology research that says it's better to do distributed practice instead of mass practice. Because if you do mass practice, which is basically cramming, you are less likely to recall the information. Okay. Just some of the biology of memory. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that's involved as one of the neurotransmitters involved in memory formation. And then, of course, the hippocampus is one of the brain structures involved in memory. And we already in the chapter 7, we've already seen that the amygdala is an emotional memorizer. So episodic memory is the two brain areas there are the hippocampus and the amygdala. And then for semantic memory, the part of the cerebral cortex that's involved with the sensation for that memory is where that memory will be stored, which is really kind of cool when you think about it. So visual memory, visual types of things, such as seeing a cow, gets stored in the occipital lobe, which is really quite cool. For the memory of objects that have to do with action, like a hammer, those are stored in the motor cortex, which is really cool. And then procedural memories are actually stored in the basal ganglia, and this gives you a perspective, the thalamus and the amygdala here. But so people who have damage in their basal ganglia, they cannot learn how to do new procedural things. All right, so that's chapter 9. Now let me switch over to chapter 10. So for chapter 10, we want to define general intelligence and also look at the evidence for multiple intelligence subtypes. And then also talk about the interactions between nature and nurture in explaining individual differences in intelligence. So if you ask 10 different psychologists what their definition of intelligence is, you will get 10 different definitions. And if you think about we've talked about the nature-nurture controversy in this class, and the fact that people argue about whether something is more nature or it's more nurture. Is it more heredity or is it more environment? And there are people who think that intelligence is more inherited, and then there are those who say it's more nurture. It's much more complicated than that because it's probably, like most things, it's both and rather than either or. So it's both nature and both nurture. So some different views of intelligence. There's a psychometric approach. They try to figure out the quantity of intelligence, and they're measuring it, and that's where the whole IQ uh, uh, thing comes from, and that's people's general intelligence, something that you can measure. And then with the cognitive view, what they look at more is the quality of your intelligence, and there are four theorists there. Sternberg and Gardner are the ones I'm going to talk about. But they're more concerned about how do we use our intelligence. So intelligence tests today, they are they're given to a sample of people with new ones out, and then the scores are arranged into a normal curve like what we're showing here. And the way this works is that the average is set at 100, and so from 85 to 115, which is about 68% of the 68% of the population, most people will fall in here in the middle. And then there are extremes of IQ where some people will fall below 70, and some people will fall over here, the extreme from 130 or above. So people over here are generally considered to be gifted. And then people over here, now, just because somebody scores below 70 or below on an IQ test does not mean that they will be given the diagnosis of an intellectual disability. In order for someone to be diagnosed with an intellectual disability, their IQ score has to fall at 70 or below. Also, they have to have some limitations in their adaptive functioning. So they're having difficulty in school, they have difficulty with social skills, they have difficulty with their day-to-day living skills like dressing themselves and things like that. So they have to have limitations in order for them to be diagnosed with an intellectual disability. So when we're looking at individual differences, genetics, nature versus nurture, of course, researchers use twin studies because they tend to indicate identical twins. Their IQ scores typically, if you do a study and you use correlations, their IQ scores are typically highly correlated. And our textbook authors say that about 75% of the population variability in adults' IQ can be attributed to genes. So remember the whole idea of heritability back from chapter 3? That's what they're looking at. But there are other psychologists who, when they look at heritability, it's a bit different. So I'll show you this. So here we're saying these heritability rates are saying that it's 50% nature and then 50% nurture. So, there's a disagreement about how much of it is nature and how much of it is nurture. So, if we want to look at the differences nurture-wise, as the amount of infectious disease has decreased, around the globe, the average IQ scores have actually gone up, and so people's health conditions and their education opportunities, etc., have influenced their IQ scores. And that's from an individual differences perspective, but from a group difference perspective, if you look at something called the Flynn effect, he is a psychologist who has looked at the IQ scores over the 20th century. And what he found is that each generation uh, has scored higher than the previous generation, as much as 3 points per decade. So what that means is that you would score higher than your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents. And so what is the difference between you and them? Well, you've had better educational opportunities. You have, you know, hopefully your nutrition and those types of things have increased and also have improved, and also you know, you're contracting infectious diseases. Although, you know, it's kind of interesting. We're in COVID-19 right now, the pandemic, and so we've hit a really interesting phenomenon right now because it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I would hope that there's not going to be changes in IQs because of the pandemic, but we'll see what happens. But one of the things about differences in IQ scores is that the test they're more formulated for people from a Western European background, and so people who come from different cultures, different backgrounds, they have scored differently, and the information processing psychologists as Sternberg and Gardner, they actually try to look at how intelligence is used, and they say that intelligence is not just one thing, it's many things. So here's Sternberg's theory of intelligence, and he says that yes, there is one type of intelligence that's measured on an intelligence test, and that's analytical intelligence. And that's your ability to solve problems and learn from context and reason and learn how to think critically. Well, those are the kinds of things that you learn in school. But these two other types of intelligences, these are not measured on an intelligence test. If somebody is creative and they come up with novel ideas and so on, that is not measured on an intelligence test. Neither is practical intelligence, which has to do with being able to solve real world problems. So a lot of people would call this your street smarts or your common sense. And street smarts here in Bowling Green, Kentucky is way different than indigenous people living in the Amazon. But can we say that they are less intelligent than we are because they might not score as high as we do on an intelligence test? Of course not. I mean, they know how to navigate their part of the world. So another information processing or cognitive psychologist is Howard Gardner. And he says that yes, there are two types of intelligence measured on an intelligence test. There's linguistic intelligence and logical mathematical intelligence. But there are all these other types of intelligence that are not measured on an intelligence test. There's spatial intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, musical intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, which is your being able to use your own emotions to help you solve a problem, and you have good coping skills. There's interpersonal intelligence, which is your social skills, being able to get along with other people, etc. And then there is naturalistic intelligence. And so there's far more than just general intelligence that would be measured on intelligence tests, these two things. So I believe that is all on chapter 10. And so I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to say that If you have any other questions before you need to or before you have to have the exam completed tomorrow evening, please send me an email, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.